Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlie Taylor. I'm one of the continuing education consultants at KDLA, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation, Cape Crusaders and Comic Books. This is a repeat of one of the great sessions from the Summer Reading Conference last fall, so hopefully you'll get some great knowledge to prepare you. Our instructor for today is Doug Wilkinson, and he's here from the Fayette County school system, and he'll be sharing his vast knowledge of superheroes and comic books with you here in just a second. A couple of reminders before we get started. Please feel free to chat in any questions, comments you have as we go along. If you have any technical issues, chat those in and I'll help you out with those. You will be getting a certificate for attending today. I'll get those emailed out to you hopefully in the next couple days. Pardon me. And you'll also be getting a link to a survey about this training, and we would very much appreciate your input on those surveys. That information really is vital to what we do here at KDLA, so very important to take the survey. So with all that said, administrative stuff out of the way, I'm going to pass control over to Doug and take it away.
All right, Charlie, can I ask you a question real quick before I get started?
Of course.
Just wanted to make sure that the audience here is librarians gearing up for the summer reading program like it was in the fall. Is that correct?
Yes, that is the intended audience.
Okay, I just want to double check to make sure.
Yes, library staff, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I appreciate the fact that you have tuned in to hear what I've got to say. As Charlie said, feel free to type in any questions there in the chat box. This is my first time doing this, so I will try to keep track of those comments down there and respond to them as I see them. As Charlie said, I am a social studies teacher in Fayette County Schools. I've been a social studies teacher for 12 years now, so you may see that my presentation has a bit of a historical bent to it because that's kind of my area or focus, and so you'll see that as I go through the presentation. I'd like to state real quickly, especially since Charlie said that there is a legal presentation going on at the same time, that while I have borrowed all these images from major comic book publishers, I am in no way profiting from them, so please don't report me to the copyright attorneys of the major publishers. So to start today, I kind of wanted to just give a little background on where most of the modern superhero culture comes from in today's society. While there are dozens of comic book publishers out there and superhero publishers out there, there are two main ones, just like there are two main political parties. Most of you are probably familiar with Marvel Comics and DC Comics. Both were at one time independent entities. In fact, up until real recently, Marvel was traded openly on the New York Stock Exchange. But DC was bought several years ago by Time Warner, so they are owned by Time Warner. Marvel is owned by Disney now, which is why you're starting to see a lot of Marvel merchandise pop up in Disney stores and Marvel-themed things at the Disney parks. So they're both owned by very large entertainment companies now, even though there are some smaller publishers out there. Excuse me. Marvel Comics, these are some of the main Marvel characters that you would see. These are characters that are pretty commonly recognized in today's society. Probably most popular from Marvel is Spider-Man, who you see in the upper right-hand corner, Hulk, Iron Man, and Captain America, of course, all very popular from the recent movies. And then you've got Wolverine up there as well. And while there are literally hundreds of characters at Marvel, these are just some of the most recognizable. Of course, their main competition is DC Comics, with arguably even more recognizable characters, many of which are older than Marvel's characters, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, of course, being DC's big three. You've also got Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, who I don't have pictured there, and so on. So a lot of very commonly recognizable characters that have been in existence in mainstream Marvel pop culture, or mainstream American pop culture for several decades now, that are experiencing a resurgence in popularity as a result of a lot of the things going on in society. Now, probably first and foremost is all the movies. There have been attempts to make superhero movies off of the comic books several times over the last several decades. Most of them usually didn't turn out very well, but once we reached the new millennium, the year 2000, the special effects had finally caught up with what a lot of movie producers and directors wanted to do, and that allowed the movies to start coming out, not just a whole bunch of them, but a whole bunch of quality ones. The Batman movies, the trilogy that recently ended, of course, have been ridiculously popular. Marvel very recently has unleashed its master plan for films going forward. They've obviously done very, very well with the Iron Man and Captain America films, as well as the Avengers films. And they're now released that they've got plans to continue that franchise in one form or another all the way up through the year 2028, with well over 24 films in the works that they are planning on producing over that time period. So one of the things that they've realized is that they can make a lot more money at the box office than they can at the comic shop. So you see increasing amounts of influence coming from that arena. Additionally, as we are good Americans, with any good movie comes merchandising. And so we have the video games and the toys, costumes, role-playing gear, all that kind of stuff, which has overwhelmed the toy aisles at your Walmarts and your Targets and so on. So this kind of just continues to feed the machine by making these characters all that much more visible and all that much more desirable, especially amongst the younger audiences. So what a lot of you are probably curious about, the kids want to read about superheroes, where do you start? There were a lot of ways I could have approached this, and so I decided to break it down in the most logical way that I could think of. So I'll have a real short presentation on what I think is good for elementary kids, a little brief presentation about what's good for middle school grades, and then finally high school and beyond. But before we get into those, I think it's important that we look at the rating system. Once upon a time, back during the Cold War in the 1950s, the U.S. government became very concerned with the proliferation of superhero comics and the idea that they would corrupt America's youth. So they created what was known as the Comics Code, and all companies that produced mainstream comics had to submit them to the U.S. government for approval before they could publish them. Then about 10 or 12 years ago, because the Comics Code was in existence for about 50 years, and then about 10 years ago, Marvel finally threw up their hands and said, we're kind of tired of dealing with this antiquated government system. We feel like we can police ourselves. So that brought about Marvel creating its own comics rating system. And as soon as Marvel did it, of course, so then did DC. So I've done my best to break it down into easily understandable ratings here. Anywhere you see it in red, that's the Marvel rating system. Anywhere you see it in blue is the DC rating system. And then if it's in black or not distinguished by color, then that means it's the same for both. So you've got the all ages or everyone rating, which you'll see applied predominantly to the books geared towards smaller children. Then you get to T and T+. T is appropriate for most readers, but parents advise they might want to look at it before they approach it with children. T+ is considered to be appropriate for teens 13 and above, so that would be equivalent to your PG-13 rating at the movie theater. Then you get up to parental advisory for Marvel, otherwise known as mature for DC. This a little bit more stringent than the T+ rating, but kind of trying to tell readers or parents that there might be more mature themes, perhaps more graphic imagery, and maybe recommended for teens and above. And then finally, Marvel, DC doesn't have a rating for this, but Marvel has one called explicit content, which probably doesn't really need an explanation. It tends to be either intensely violent or intensely sexual themes, and probably not the kinds of things that you all are looking for the libraries. So the rating system looks a lot like the movie rating system for the most part. So when you start looking at elementary age comics, there's a boatload of things out there that are easily accessible to younger readers. And a lot of these are spin-offs of popular cartoon shows. So for example, if you're looking at the slide here, you can see the one in the top left-hand corner that says Avengers Assemble Season 2, which is a pretty direct parallel to the Avengers Assemble cartoon on Disney XD. Also down to the bottom, you can see the Batman Brave and the Bold, which that cartoon is no longer on the air, but that was a comic book that was based off of that cartoon. You can generally identify these all ages, friendly comics by the look of them, and you can see they tend to look more cartoony, friendlier, lots of bright colors. Tiny Titans there in particular looks very, very reader-friendly, of course, as do the Scribblenauts. So these are the kinds of things that are pretty safe and especially good for young readers. The stories tend to be self-contained. They're not serialized, so you don't have to feel like you got to read several issues in a row. You can sit down, read a story, and pretty solidly enjoy it. In that same vein, I have two children of my own, one's 10 and one's 6. And these are some books that were published a couple of years ago that my kids really, really like, called The Super Pets, because obviously what's better than a superhero than a pet superhero if you're applying to a younger demographic. All of these books were produced by a guy named Art Baltazar. He wrote and drew all of them, or helped write and draw all of them. And pretty much anything you find with Art Baltazar's name on it is going to be great for elementary age kids. It's all very, very reader friendly. There's usually a lot of humor involved. And you can tell by the imagery here, they're pretty action-packed. And what I really, really liked about these books, especially for my kids as they were learning to read, is that these are not traditional comic books with all the panels. They're actually more chapter books. They have 3 chapters each with a lot of pictures. They also have some little jokes and games involved, extra activities as well. But these were books that were very, very popular with my kids and very safe for younger audiences. Before we move on to middle grades, did anyone have any questions about elementary age stuff or all ages comics? If you do, feel free to type those in the chat box and I'll address those. I see Charlie is typing there, so I'll wait and see what she's got to say. Yeah, she's saying the same thing. Yeah, feel free to put in questions as we go. I'm happy to answer them. I'll try to keep my eyes on the box down there. So we'll go ahead and look at middle grades. This is where you start to expand things a little bit. This is where your readers, I think, are going to get a little more serious. Maybe they've seen a movie. Maybe they've seen one of the TV shows. DC Comics has done very, very well, even since I gave this presentation in September with some new TV shows. You all may have seen the Gotham TV show has been very, very popular, kind of an early Batman TV show, plus Arrow and Flash. So a lot of these kids, I think, as they get into the middle grades, are going to have seen the TV shows or maybe the movies and might be interested in reading this. Oh, that's right. I forgot the Daredevil show. Thank you, Randall. The Daredevil show on Netflix has been very well received, and there are other ones following that as well. I think there's an Iron Fist and maybe a Luke Cage show coming as well. Let's see, Caitlin is typing something here. I did not know there was a Supergirl show coming out. Caitlin says there'll be a Supergirl show on CBS in the fall. I didn't know that. I'm sure that that will be very, very well received. So because kids are going to be seeing these sorts of things, they're probably going to be looking for things in the library to read. I've listed here a lot of characters. You've got Marvel characters listed on the left and DC characters listed on the right. These are generally pretty safe bets. I mean, if you find a collected edition of Spider-Man, Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, X-Men, the Avengers, from DC, your basics, Green Lantern, Flash, Wonder Woman, Superman, and so on, these are all pretty safe bets. I would caution, if you're looking at Batman books, there has just been such a tremendous amount of Batman material that's been published in the last 20 or 30 years. A lot of it is all ages appropriate, but a lot of it is mature reader stuff as well. He's such a popular character, and the movies kind of created this much darker, grim and gritty personality for him that I would definitely take a close look at a Batman book and make sure I knew exactly what I was getting before I purchased those for my library. The other thing to consider is it used to be very, very difficult to get collected editions, often called trade paperbacks or TPBs, of mainstream comics. Marvel and DC both were loath for a very long time to reprint any of their material, but with the emergence of the movies and the changing nature of digital media, they've suddenly in the last 5 to 10 years become very, very much more comfortable in reprinting their materials. So you can find a lot of collected editions, a given storyline of Iron Man or Flash or whoever in those collected volumes that are easy to put on a bookshelf. The movie adaptations, I think, are great, especially for the late elementary or middle school. They're nice because they've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. They're a nice, coherent story. They're easily found because typically the covers of them look just about like the movie posters do, with the photorealistic covers as opposed to traditional drawn or art covers. So I think that these are easily found. and usually highly desirable and accessible to those late elementary or middle school kids. And again, with all the Marvel movies coming out and all the Marvel and DC TV shows, my guess is that there will be plenty more of these to be had. Randall points out that, and he's absolutely right about this, lots of great Marvel and DC cartoon movies. Most of them have been direct-to-DVD releases, but there's plenty of those available, along with comic book adaptations of those as well. Now, as far as some beginner books, if kids are interested, if a kid comes to you after seeing the Green Lantern movie or the Flash TV show and says, hey, what do you have on the Flash or what do you have on Green Lantern? DC a few years ago started a kind of a line of relaunching a lot of their classic characters with some new origins. So the Rebirth books by Jeff Johns, you got Flash Rebirth and Green Lantern Rebirth are very popular ones. Again, it's nice to kind of give a jumping off point, a way to sort of get involved when maybe there wasn't an easy way to do that before. Superman for All Seasons is another one that kind of tells Superman's origins in a new way. So these are some really, really popular ones for kids who are looking to get started but maybe need to start at the beginning somewhere. I see that Caitlin says here, not all are age appropriate. That's true. Some of those, I think she's referring to what Randall's comment there about the cartoon movies. Some of those direct-to-DVD cartoon movies are probably not all ages appropriate. So again, looking at the rating system on those is probably a good way to go. Now, I think things get a little more interesting when we get into high school and beyond. There are a lot of other worlds that kind of open up. Starting in the late 1970s, a lot of comic book writers started getting into much more complex storytelling, which often leads to a lot more mature themes. Oftentimes these themes include some fundamental but classic storylines, love and hate, what kinds of things motivate humans. Oftentimes there's less fighting in these more complex books, a lot more interpersonal relationships. Why do people do things the way they do? Why would a villain be a villain? Why would a hero be a hero? Those sorts of things. Often when you get to these more mature books, they often are more dense. You will see a lot more pictures and text per page. So that's another good way to identify something that might be more geared towards a high school level. One of my very favorites is a book called Kingdom Come. It was a 4-issue story, which you can now easily buy in a collected volume. It was written by Mark Waid with painted artwork. It's all painted watercolor artwork by Alex Ross. And it was a story about the future of the DC universe. What happens when the superheroes get too old, when they're past their prime, when society doesn't seem to need them anymore. And like a lot of classic DC stories, it's kind of the ultimate Superman versus Batman story. Superman, kind of the classic example of the Superman, someone who's virtually invulnerable, who will likely live forever, who kind of exists in a plane above humanity, whereas Batman is kind of the ultimate human hero, a self-made guy who relies on gadgets and his own wits, and the two of them often find themselves at odds. As an example, I've got a panel here from Kingdom Come where you see Superman here talking to Bruce Wayne or Batman, talking about even though they may have their differences and different methods, the one thing they've always had in common is that they couldn't stand the idea of taking a human life. So this is the kind of deeper interaction as opposed to typical good guy, bad guy, good guy beats up bad guy goes to jail story. This is a good example of the kind of human interaction, human motivation stories that you're likely to find in these higher end books. Perhaps the most famous of all graphic novels, and some of you may already have this in your library, is a book called Watchman. Watchmen was published in 1985 and 1986 originally, and it is often referred to as the classic deconstruction of the American superhero. Written by a British author by the name of Alan Moore and illustrated by a British author by the name of Dave Gibbons, Alan Moore is known as an author who likes to take the traditional superhero and unveil it in some kind of new or different way. He's got a long track record of these kinds of books that peel away the spandex costume and the punching the bad guy to find out what really motivates somebody to put on a costume and go out and fight crime. It's one of the first apocalyptic graphic novels, probably the granddaddy of all apocalyptic graphic novels, where you've got a team of older, washed-up superheroes that are facing down Armageddon, and they're kind of at a loss of what to do. This book was such a landmark book. It was one of the first comics to read the Hugo Award, or excuse me, to win the Hugo Award for science fiction. And when Time magazine published its top 100 books of the 20th century in 2000, Watchman made the list. It was the only comic book to make the list. It does have lots and lots of mature themes. This is the kind of thing that you do definitely want to know when it kid comes to you and asks about it. You want to know exactly what you're showing them. It does have tremendous street-level violence, lots of sexual themes, a significant amount of language, and lots of Cold War geopolitical strategies as well. So it's a dense book with a lot of very complex issues in it, and they are very mature issues as well. To give you an idea, when I say dense, when I'm talking about the pictures and the text, here are a couple of pages from Watchmen, and you can see how each page has 9 small panels, and they're packed with imagery and with text. This is not the kind of thing you can breeze through in a few minutes and have gotten the whole story. Watchmen is a book that I've read many, many times, and every time I read it, there are additional tidbits, additional layers, additional things that I've seen and found. But it is definitely a mature reader's book. See, Caitlin is typing there, so I'm going to wait and see what she has to say here before I move on. While she's still typing, I'll go ahead and move to the next page, I think. Oh, there it is. Let's see. Yeah, Caitlin wants to point out that, there's, to go along with the idea of those mature themes, there is the revelation in there that one of the characters does get raped. There is, like I said, a lot of street-level violence. It is a very, very mature book, so you definitely want to know exactly what you're checking out of your library if this is one that you choose to put in there. But it is a tremendously well-written book that will make people stop and think. In going along with the idea of those more mature level books, I wanted to pitch some of my personal favorites, things that may not have quite the notoriety that Watchmen or Kingdom Come have, but things that I think are really, really phenomenal books that I really enjoy. I actually taught a class a few years ago. It was Modern American History through comic books. And so the chore that I had at the beginning was to sit down and say, how do I want to tell the history of post-World War II America? Which comics do I want to use to do that? For those of you who are unaware, Superman first popped onto the scene from DC Comics in 1938. Most mainstream heroes came in the late 30s and early 40s through World War II, and so that's kind of where my jumping in point was. So one of the first books that I chose in teaching this class to look at the 1940s and early 50s was a book called The Golden Age, written by James Robinson with art by Richard Ory. It's set immediately following World War II, and because so many mainstream heroes had been created to fight World War II, there were a great deal of comic book covers made during World War II that showed, some costumed hero punching out Hitler or sinking a Japanese aircraft carrier or something like that. Once the war was over, a lot of these heroes found themselves without direction, and that's what Robinson wanted to explore. What do these superheroes do when their cause, that is World War II, is no longer around? So what I love about The Golden Age is it explores a lot of the traditional early Cold War issues, paranoia, McCarthyism, feminism, which was, of course, emerging as a result of Rosie the Riveter and the emergence of the female worker. There's a lot of a look at drug use and alcoholism, the idea of unquestioned patriotism without asking us critical questions, and the fear of nuclear weapons. The Golden Age, much like I just lost my train of thought. Much like Kingdom Come was published as 4 issues, but it can easily be found as a collected edition today. Here's a little excerpt from that. It's not the easiest book to find today. It's not currently in print from DC Comics. In fact, when I was using it in my class, I could not buy a class set of copies because it wasn't currently in print. So I had to scan all the pages for my own personal copy and then show it on the screen to my class. But used copies can easily be found on Amazon, can be found on eBay, places like that. And I managed to accumulate over a couple of years about 10 copies of my own for classroom use. So it can be had, probably just not from your traditional publishers or from the traditional places where you find them. Another one that I like a great deal is New Frontier, which was written and drawn by a guy named Darwin Cook. Darwin Cook is a artist who specializes in mimicking 60s era artwork. So pretty much everything he does has that late 50s, early 60s feel to it. And this was the second book that I chose following Golden Age for the class that I taught, because it really picks up right where Golden Age left off, starting in the 1950s and carries into the early 1960s. It explores a lot of the same themes that you would associate with the early 60s. From the emergence of science fiction, you've got the fear of alien invasion, nuclear proliferation. It explores racial tensions of the early 60s. Again, visits issues like feminism and the growing concern over Vietnam, all issues explored in Darwin Cook's New Frontier. And of course, those of you who are history students like myself will recognize the title New Frontier is taken directly from John F. Kennedy's administration and his desire to put a man on the moon, which he, of course, promised in his inaugural address in 1961. Here's a cover from the collected edition of New Frontier. You can see that Wonder Woman factors in it prominently, as does Green Lantern, Flash. Superman is a little bit less of a role in this one, not quite as prominent, and a lot of other more obscure DC heroes from the time period as well. Challengers of the Unknown in the flying car there, as well as Adam Strange in the red outfit. If you look carefully down at the bottom of that cover image, you'll see a guy in a black hood, and it looks like he's carrying a stick. That's a character that was created by Darwin Cook and kind of inserted in that time period to explore the racial tensions of the time period, because DC did not really have any strong or effective African-American heroes in the 1960s, so Darwin Cook kind of retrofit one in there to help tell the story that he wanted to tell. Another book that I'm a big fan of that I also used in class is a book called Marvels by author Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross again, who you might remember from Kingdom Come, another fully painted artwork book that he did. It traces the history of the United States from 1939 all the way through 1980, but does it through the history of Marvel superheroes. And it addresses lots and lots of issues from modern American history. What makes Marvel's different and what makes it something of a landmark book amongst the pantheons of comic books is that it's told from the perspective of your average everyday guy on the street instead of the perspective of heroes. So rather than, Spider-Man swinging around town looking for the Green Goblin or Dr. Octopus or whoever and muttering to himself about the fact that he can't find this guy, instead it would be an average citizen on the street who just happens to see Spider-Man swing by. Now, I will say this frustrated my kids a great deal in class because that person on the street then may not see the beginning or end of the battle. They might only see the middle part with Spider-Man swing by, which is not traditional storytelling from our standpoint. We're used to getting a beginning, a middle, and an end, as opposed to just seeing a little snippet of what goes on. But it allows Busiek, the author, to tell much richer and much more complex human interest stories instead of just your typical superhero beat-em-ups kind of stories. Let's see. Here are the covers of various issues of Marvels, and it's told ultimately from the perspective of a photographer. And if you look at the cover in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that that photographer, Phil Sheldon, is taking a picture of a superhero giant man as he steps across the skyline. So the entire book was told from the perspective of this Phil Sheldon photographer as he managed to take pictures of important events throughout the history of the Marvel Universe. The next one there, you see Angel of the X-Men carrying a small child away. It did a really, really nice job of taking a lot of the traditional Stan Lee and Jack Kirby stories from Marvel Comics of the 60s that were clearly inspired by current events of the time and kind of retelling them. For example, the X-Men, led by Charles Xavier, a bald guy in a wheelchair, used to ride around in his wheelchair in the 60s all the time saying, I have a dream that one day humans and mutants will live together in peace. Well, obviously that had been taken straight from the headlines of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. So this allowed Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross to kind of re-explore some of those inspirations of the events of the 1960s and kind of remind readers how a lot of these characters got their start from major events of the 1960s. And you may have noticed on the last slide there it said that Marvel's kind of set the stage for a creator-owned series called Astro City, which is the last of my favorites I want to introduce you to today. Astro City kind of takes Marvel's to the nth degree, and it's not published by either Marvel or DC. It's an independent universe, and all these characters, if you're familiar with your Supermans and your Batmans and your Spider-Mans and so on, you can see kind of versions of all those characters who live in Astro City, which is quite clearly supposed to be New York City. But these are all creator-owned characters that were created by Busiek and Alex Ross to kind of coexist in this city. And it still has that same Marvel's viewpoint of stories being told from the average man on the street, but it allows Busiek to tell these stories with more freedom since he's not bound by the continuity of the Marvel or the DC universes. Now, Astro City can be complicated when you're looking to buy volumes of it, simply because it's been published by a variety of different publishers. The very first volume was self-published independently by Kurt Busiek. Then it was published for a while by a company called Image Comics. You can see that on the cover all the way to the right. Most currently, it is actually being published by DC Comics, but DC is simply the publisher. They don't own any rights to the characters, and none of the characters make appearances in DC Comics. So this is, like I said, one of those books. It's been published in a variety of venues and a variety of different publishers, but a really solid read. Every issue is a good one, and it's currently still being published by an imprint of DC Comics. Now, not surprisingly, in American society, anytime something is successful, everybody will get in on the act. And while Marvel and DC have both been publishing for several decades, there are many other small publishers currently operating, and lots of other small publishers who have come and gone over the years. When I was a kid, the also-rans behind Marvel and DC were companies like First Comics and Eclipse Comics, neither one of which are in business now. But there are a lot of other companies out there currently like Dynamite, Boom. Those are not the same company, even though they sound like they would go together. IDW is a popular one. Dark Horse publishes a lot of licensed properties. So there are a lot of things out there being published that are kind of off the beaten path a little bit, but certainly would appeal to a lot of readers, maybe especially ones who are not particularly interested in the superhero genre. And that brings me to my last slide here, which is licensed properties. My kids, as much as I love them and they love me, they do not share my passion for superheroes. They don't share my passion for pop culture and the history that it brings with it. So when we go to the comic shop together, they wind up picking something more like this. My daughter's a big fan of the Tinkerbell comics. She likes those a lot. My son likes the Angry Birds and Star Wars comics. I've been known to pick up the occasional Transformers comic and relive my childhood a little bit. So there's plenty of other things out there beyond just your mainstream superheroes for kids that are interested in reading comics, but maybe not interested in the superhero genre. So I've thrown an awful lot of information at you, and I'm sure you all have questions. So I'm going to sit back here for just a minute and ask to see if anyone's got any questions that I could answer for you. I see that Randall is typing here, so we'll see what he has to say. Cross-cultural or non-white supers that can be promoted. There are, interestingly, if you look at the history of both Marvel and DC, they have kind of a habit of making cross-cultural characters into either new versions of existing characters or sidekicks to existing characters. As an example, in the 1970s, Marvel felt compelled to add an African-American hero to the Captain America book, so they created a character named Falcon, who was an African-American sidekick to Captain America. Now, keep in mind that was in the 1970s. Only last year did they finally feel obliged to promote the Falcon to the rank of Captain America and give him his own book. So, unfortunately, the progress of cross-cultural characters has been hamstrung quite a bit, mostly amongst the publishers, I think, unwillingness to devote books to minority characters. Now, having said that, there are some good examples out there. For example, if you've seen the Iron Man films, you might recognize a character named James Rhodes, who's in the military, who's an African-American gentleman who in the second movie gets his own set of armor and flies around as a character named War Machine. What started out as kind of an offhanded idea that was only supposed to hang around for a couple of issues back in the 80s has developed into a full-fledged character, and War Machine, or James Rhodes, has had several runs of his own book, and I believe is going to be at least an additional character in the upcoming Avengers film that comes out next month as well. So that's one example. Recently, Marvel has chosen to throw off a lot of the traditional cultural boundaries of having predominantly white male heroes and really kind of try some different things just in the last couple of years. I mentioned the African-American Captain America, which is new. They also replaced the traditional old Thor, the Thunder God, with a female version of Thor. Now, that's not a book that I've read, but I've heard very good things about it. Additionally, the Captain Marvel book at Marvel has been replaced with a female character, Carol Danvers, and Ms. Marvel is a Muslim American who has her own book now, and I hear those are quite popular as well. In addition, DC a few years ago introduced a new Green Lantern who is a Muslim American. So there are some examples out there, but unfortunately there's not a tremendous amount of them. I see Caitlin has pointed out that Captain Marvel and Ms. Marvel are great for teen girls. I would agree with that. They're great books, and they're fairly new books too, which makes them an easy jumping on point for kids who are interested. As far as LGBT characters, that's another one that's been slow in coming. Unless I'm mistaken, I believe back in 1988 or 1989, Marvel Comics revealed that one of their characters, and not a main character whatsoever, it was a kind of a small-time character from a small-time book. They actually have a Canadian team called Alpha Flight, and they revealed that one of the characters in Alpha Flight was gay back, like I said, 88 or 89. Since then, I know Marvel has a group called the Young Avengers that has a couple of gay males in it. Hulkling and Wiccan, I think, are their names. Yeah, Randall, I see you got Batwoman up there, who is a lesbian character at DC. So, like I said, it's really unfortunate in a lot of ways that cultural diversity has been so long in coming to mainstream superhero comics. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that the two major publishers have found themselves hamstrung for a long time by decades and decades of continuity. For example, if Superman's always been, Clark Kent from Krypton, it's pretty hard to create a whole new Superman without just simply giving up on decades of previous history. Excuse me. Having said that, Marvel and DC both have discovered that there's a tremendous amount of money to be made in TV shows and movies. And I think a good example of where they're willing to finally give up on those decades and decades of continuity is the Nick Fury character from Avengers. If anyone has seen the Avengers film, Nick Fury is kind of the man behind the scenes who puts Captain America and Iron Man and everybody on the same team together, and he's played by the really famous actor Samuel L. Jackson. Interestingly enough, Nick Fury, a character who had been around at Marvel Comics going all the way back to World War II, was a white guy. But they felt that Samuel L. Jackson was the right guy for the role, and I think most people would agree. So they went ahead and cast him in the role of Nick Fury for the movie, and it was so successful that the Marvel Comics then felt the need to introduce a black Nick Fury character into the comics, and that's worked out quite well for them as well. I think for people looking for, looking for that diversity amongst superheroes, even though it hasn't necessarily existed before now, at least we're kind of in a golden age period where there's plenty of that to be had, at least at the moment. I saw that Deborah was typing there something for a minute, but then she went away, so I don't know if she's got something or if anyone else has another question to ask. I think one thing, while some people are typing there, I noticed that when Randall asked about LGBT characters, and Deborah, I see your question. I'll get to that in just 1 second. One of the things I think that comic books are lacking today is that for a long, long time, there was always a letters page in the back where fans could write in letters. And when companies started to introduce gay characters to mainstream comics, there would not surprisingly be a lot of debate on those letter pages between people about whether or not that was appropriate. And unfortunately, with the lack of people actually reading comics and more people just watching movies and TV shows, those letter pages have largely gone away, which has kind of made the debate go away. Deborah, you asked about the Tinkerbell book says Free Comic Book Day. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Free Comic Book Day, but Free Comic Book Day was started several years ago, I'm going to say 7 or 8 years ago, and it was an attempt to try to get more people into comic book shops and reading comic books. And in fact, it's coming up. It's May. I don't remember. I'm wanting to say maybe the first Saturday in May, so it's probably right around the corner. And what it is anyone can go into any comic shop, or most comic shops anyway, as long as they're participating, and all of the major publishers will have free comic books that anyone can pick up. Now, as far as can libraries get them for free, I don't know exactly how that would work. I do know that the comic shop that I frequent here in Lexington saves whatever free comic books for Free Comic Book Day that they receive, because they're not legally allowed to sell them, I don't believe. So they save up their free ones and then donate them to local libraries. And I see some of you saying, yeah, May 2nd. So May 2nd is Free Comic Book Day. I would find a local comic book shop and contact them and maybe ask them if you could have whatever leftovers they have for free and see what they say, because I think that's what my local shop does. Randall, one of the SRP events I'm doing is Women in Comics. Fortunately, there's no lack of female characters. That is absolutely true. There are plenty of female characters. And finally, they're starting to get starring roles. Wonder Woman was kind of the go-to female character for a very, very long time. And for a long time, she was about the only one. But a lot of characters recently, especially like Spider-Woman and Spider-Girl from the Spider-Man universe, have gotten a lot of attention lately. Captain Marvel and Ms. Marvel we mentioned earlier. There are more and more female characters carrying their own books now, which did not always be the case. But you're right, there are plenty of characters out there. Let's see. Yeah, so May 2nd is Free Comic Book Day. Deborah says she'll contact Comic Book Shop and see if we can get the extras. That's fantastic. That's a great idea. See what they say to that. I'm trying to think what other female characters out there are carrying books right now, and my mind is blanking at the moment. Yeah, She-Hulk, that's a good example. And there's a couple of different She-Hulks now. There's a red one and a green one. Don't ask. But there's multiple She-Hulks. I don't know if she currently has her own book, but she has before. I'm a big fan of the Wasp, who's a member of the Avengers. Black Widow has her own book, also a member of the Avengers. Oh, and all the DC ones, absolutely. Caitlin, you're right. Catwoman, Batgirl, Batwoman. I kind of stopped reading DC a couple of years ago when they rebooted everything. I'd forgotten about all of them. And Randall mentions Rogue. There are lots and lots of female X-Men, which kind of defies the name X-Men. They probably ought to be called X-Women. But, you know, several books recently from Marvel have had all-female X-Men casts as well. So, again, you know, for people looking for diversity, this is definitely the time to be reading. This is the time when there's lots of them out there. As far as the free comic book day thing goes, I would point out, too, that oftentimes, I know it's true this year, the really big publishers like Marvel and DC will often use free comic book day as an opportunity to launch a new book or a new storyline. So oftentimes the free comics from free comic book day can be good jumping on points for new stories. I see that Caitlin says that all new X-Men is led by Jean Grey, and I believe that's the one with the all-female cast, I think. Caitlin, you can verify that for me, but I think that's true. Randall says, did the TV show Heroes make a comic book? Yes, they did for a short period of time. I remember watching the first season of Heroes when it was out, and there were some action figures and some comics that came out. But if memory serves, that show did well for a season or two and then kind of fell off the map fairly quickly. And I think when it did so, it took most of the merchandising, including the comics, with it. I don't think there were a lot published, although I do think there were a few. I see Randall is typing there. Certainly, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to jump in. Yeah, Elektra, another good one. And I know that she's carried her own book off and on before. I don't think she currently has one, but I know she's had her own title in the past. It's good to see a lot of the female characters who were used predominantly as supporting characters for a long time finally getting their chance to be their own, carry their own books and have their own adventures as opposed to simply following along with other characters. Other titles like Archie's and Flintstones and so on, it's interesting that for a long time, most of the time when I was reading and collecting comics, a lot of those titles had kind of fallen by the wayside. A lot of my prime reading years, there wasn't a lot of non-superhero stuff to be had. Again, in the last 10 years, it seems like diversity is the order of the day, and there are more and more things out there. Archie books have been being published nonstop for at least 30 or 40 years now, maybe longer. Although I know that Archie has had some unusual adventures of late. I know there was an Archie with zombies title not too long ago. I think Archie was actually killed off for a period of time in his own book. Archie got married at some point. So the Archie books are certainly still out there, several different titles of varying levels of storytelling. I know that IDW, I believe, has recently acquired the rights to start making Scrooge McDuck comics again. Scrooge McDuck, of course, was huge back in the 30s and 40s. Scrooge McDuck comics were very, very popular then. And I know IDW is publishing those, which I find very odd since Scrooge McDuck is a Disney property and Disney owns Marvel. You would think those would be published at Marvel, but I don't know all the copyright stuff there. Obviously, Angry Birds comics based off of the video game, My Little Pony. There's a lot more of that sort of thing out there. There just doesn't seem to be quite the audience for kind of the old traditional stuff like Flintstones that there was, 20 or 30 years ago. William, I see, William Sutton says Birds of Prey has an all-female cast. That's absolutely true. I don't know if it's still the same characters it used to be, but I know it was kind of Black Canary and Catwoman and Huntress there for a while. Debbie says she's had some success introducing classics in the graphic novel form. Absolutely, and I think those are a fantastic resource. The whole, Classics Illustrated line has been around for many, many years. It's kind of bounced around from publisher to publisher, but Poe's stuff and Shakespeare's stuff, things with traditionally high-interest stories, love stories or horror stories, told in the visual form, I think can hook a lot of readers that might not be interested otherwise. I would definitely say that those are a great avenue. Caitlin says Archie died taking a bullet for the first openly gay character. I did not know that. I knew that he died. I'd read that he had died, but I didn't know that was how or why. That's fascinating. I had no idea. Randall, Disney's making Star Wars comics again. Absolutely. Dark Horse had published Star Wars comics for decades. And then when Marvel was purchased by DC, purchased by Disney, and then Disney, of course, then purchased the Star Wars license, and they brought all those into the same house. And yes, Marvel just in January, as a matter of fact, started publishing Star Wars comics again. And one would have to assume that when the movie comes out in December, the new Star Wars movie, that there will be comics to go along with that as well, and I'm sure that they will be incredibly popular. Do they still do Star Trek as a comic? Right this instant, I don't know. I know that not long ago, DC was publishing Star Trek comics. That's another license that has bounced around amongst a lot of different companies over the years. I'm unaware of whether or not there are currently Star Trek comics being published, but I know at least as of a few years ago there were. And if they're not being published right now, it's only a matter of time. Star Trek Doctor Who crossovers, that's one I was unfamiliar with, but that seems like a good way to bring a couple of audiences together and make a lot of money, so that makes sense. I think it's interesting that you can probably, if you look hard enough, you can find comic books for just about any pop culture phenomenon out there that you want, as long as you're willing to look. It's just a matter of what company holds the license to publish books with that title at that time. Debbie says, I have an ABDO catalog with Star Trek for 2014. Okay, so clearly as recently as last year it was being published. At least I assume that's the catalog you can order stuff from there. So, so yeah, there's plenty of avenues, plenty of things to be had out there. It's just a matter of, like I said, if you're willing to look for them. I'm not sure how much success you all have had trying to put actual just individual issues in the library. I mean, much like magazines, they probably don't have a tremendously long shelf life. But the collected volumes, the ones that are bound like paperbacks, would probably be very, very popular in most libraries. Okay, Debbie, yes, that would make sense that, yeah, Star Trek 2014 would be the cast of the latest movies. That would make a lot of sense then. Comics that would coincide with the movies, to have them in shops at the same time as the movies coming out would make a lot of sense. Randall, you say a Dewey poster. Do you mean Dewey Decimal System? Oh, okay, I gotcha. That'd be pretty cool. I didn't know they made such a thing. That'd be pretty interesting. Does anyone else have any questions? I see Deborah's got a question. Randall has two of them. He's looking to trade one, I think. It's a hot commodity. Cheryl, I don't know. I don't know that I have anything that gives me any more credibility than anyone else, but I do hope the information that I shared today does help you out in looking for what you want to buy for the library. Larissa, you're very welcome. Everybody, I'm glad I could be of help.
This is Charlie. I'm going to go ahead and jump in here at the end, Doug. I've just got one more slide I need to show. In case people would like to download the slides to use at another date or to share with their coworkers, we've got that option. I'm going to change the screen real quick, and they'll see the option to download those slides. So the instructions are on the left-hand side of that slide there. There's the files box that's directly underneath the PowerPoint. Just click on the name of the presentation inside that box and then click the download file button, and that'll allow you to download the slides, and I encourage you to share it with your coworkers and refer back to it. KDLA would really like to thank you, Doug, for taking your very precious time, I know, as a teacher, to share this great webinar with us. This is the second time I've heard it, and it was still just so much fun to listen to, and I'm not even a big comic book reader, so it's just so much fun.
Well, I'm glad. I'm happy to have done it. And listen, if I didn't think to put this out there sooner, I should have. If you want to share my email address with the attendees, if they've got questions later on, I don't know if there's a way to do that, but please feel free to do so.
I will. I'll be sending out a follow-up email to everybody that will have a survey and a certificate, and I'll include your contact info. Maybe they can ask you for suggestions or anything at a later time. So
that'd be great.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending today. Whenever you're ready to exit, just click that X in the top right-hand corner of the screen, and just a reminder that I did record this webinar today, and it'll be up on our archive training sessions page hopefully in the next couple days. So thank you all so much for attending. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, Doug. Talk to you later.
Have a good one.
You too.